Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Berak Hussain. I'm a registered psychotherapist in Ottawa, Canada, and I am virtually at the Hussaini Islamic Center in Orlando, Florida. Thank you very much for all of you who are joining us for this program this afternoon. I'm just going to wait for people to join in before we officially begin. And the program that we have developed for you is a two-part series, inshallah, taking a look at empowering your mind, body, heart, and soul. Part one, we'll be taking a look at mental health, mental talk, and we'll get into the details in a moment in terms of what we'll be covering. So we can just have the slides up, please. So again, with the Hussaini Islamic Center of Orlando, Florida, we are presenting to you this program today to take a look at what mental health is, how it impacts you, and so on and so forth. So we just go on to our next slide. Inshallah. I always like to begin these types of presentations with this beautiful ayah from the Quran. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ala bidhikrillah tatma'inna al-qulub. Verily, with the remembrance of Allah, do our hearts find serenity or peace or tranquility. And inshallah, the discussions today, it's not just going to be me talking. Inshallah, we'll be able to interact both on Facebook as well as on YouTube, and we're monitoring the questions. So I'm going to be asking questions, and please, all of you, please do respond and engage and ask questions along the way, and then we'll do a proper Q&A at the end. And our discussion will be in terms of mental health, wellness, and we see in this surah, Surah Al-Ra'd, the thunder, Allah expresses guidance, subhanahu wa ta'ala, to attaining that inner peace, that serenity through dhikr and remembrance. And inshallah, the dhikr and remembrance that we're going to be looking at today is the pursuit of that knowledge of understanding what mental health is and psychology, and through the series in terms of looking at our overall well-being, inshallah. All right, so trying to understand what mental health is in our community. And so we'll be taking a look at today what mental health is. We'll be taking a look at some statistics. In addition to that, we'll be jumping into looking at what are some of the misconceptions, barriers, and common illnesses that we do have. We'll be taking a look at what counseling is. There's so much misunderstandings around that. We'll look at gender variances. We'll quickly take a look at some of the signs of depression, anxiety, and we'll end off in support and resources. Inshallah, in our next session, we'll be delving into taking care of our stress, overall stress management, and mindfulness practices. And at the end of that session, inshallah, we'll be doing a full mindfulness spiritual meditation, inshallah. All right, so let's get started. So when you hear the word mental health, what essentially comes to your mind, right? And please do share your thoughts on this as we go through this definition. Essentially, what it is, it's all about balance. And we can see here through the definition that is given by the Canadian Mental Health Association, and it's about striking a balance in all aspects of your life: the social, the physical, the spiritual, economic, and the mental, right? And if we go delve deeper in terms of what the World Health Organization explains it as, it's defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential and can cope with the normal stresses of life, essentially work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So these definitions are straight up clear. They're safe, so to speak, right? These are things that we can definitely connect with, and they're not something scary, so to speak, but there's still so much fear and misunderstanding and even denial within our own communities as to what mental health is. Usually when we ask this question, we take a look at what mental health is, right? And what we see is that people right away, when we ask that question, start saying things such as depression, anxiety, and a lot of other negative thought patterns to it, right? What's interesting here is that I didn't really ask the question what mental illness is. Rather, we took a look at what is mental health. Just like we have our physical health, we have our mental health. If we don't take care of our physical health, we're not going to do well, right? Same thing with our mental health. If you don't take care of all of these aspects in your life, then you're going to struggle or suffer in one of them, which can then potentially lead to a disorder, which then can potentially lead to an illness if you don't take care of it, right? So this is one of our first misconceptions that we just demystified in terms of understanding mental health as similar to physical health. And when we have that understanding, then we can delve deeper. All of you who are watching today, inshallah, you are ambassadors and will be ambassadors after we finish this series in terms of understanding what mental health is all about, so that when you go back out into your community, when you hear about a situation, family or close ones or wherever, you have a basic understanding and knowledge of what this is to help and contribute to demystifying the stigma and the taboo around mental health. So let's go on to our next slide and go deeper into understanding what mental health and well-being is all about. So essentially what it is, it's crucial to have that level, that optimal level of wellness in order to be able to live a higher quality of life, right? We know that wellness matters because everything we do and every emotion we feel relates back to our well-being, which in turn, our well-being directly affects our actions and emotions. So it's an ongoing cycle, right? So at this point, it's important for everyone to achieve their optimal level of wellness in order to reduce stress, which then reduces the risk of illness and ensures positive interactions. We go on to the next slide. We see here from the University of California, Davis campus, the Student Health and Counseling Services, which is very similar to where I work at the Health and Counseling Services at Carleton University. They talk about this 8 dimensions of wellness, right? Which is interrelated with one another. So if we take a look here, each of these dimensions here is equally vital, right, in the pursuit of that optimal health. You can reach one optimal health level of wellness by understanding how to maintain and optimize each of the dimensions of wellness. And if we compare this to a hadith narrated by Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salam, in where he says to divide your time into 4 parts, right? An hour to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, an hour to work or provide for your family, an hour to socialize with friends and those who are trustworthy and can keep your secrets, and lastly, an hour for yourselves in where you can perform what you can desire without falling into haram. What you see here is this hadith exemplifying from 1400 years ago what now modern psychology and research is saying about the different dimensions in our life. These 8 dimensions are very similar and divided into the 4 that we have here, right? And essentially we want to divide our time. It doesn't mean literally in terms of 4 parts, right? In terms of an hour here, an hour there, but balancing it. That's the key thing. So we want to create that balance and reaching our full potential in each of these areas, so that we can maintain that wellness, inshallah, which contributes to an overall positive mental health. So you see right away here the connection to our Islamic faith when it comes to wellness, balance, and overall mental health. So now we go on to our next slide. We'll take a look at some of the statistics that we have in the U.S.A. So we know from the resources that I've cited here that nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults live with a mental illness or know somebody over a lifetime, or friends or relative colleagues who may have experienced a mental illness. So the prevalence of any mental illness was higher amongst women, interestingly enough, than men. And we'll take a look at this later on in terms of gender variances, a little bit more detail. We see here in terms of youth, so those who experience those mental health conditions continue to rise. And especially in the last year of the pandemic, these numbers have risen even more. So we see here that young adults from 18 to 25, they have the highest prevalence of mental illness compared to the adults aged 26 to 49. So 25.8% versus 22. And then 50 and older, it's down to 13.8. So we see the trend, that more Americans are being insured and accessing care, which is a positive, but many still experience a mental health condition and still report having an unmet need. This also shows there's that in the workplace, a lot of shortage rather remains because people are not getting the support that they need in order to be productive, hence perhaps missing a lot of work and so on and so forth. If we look at UK statistics and Canadian statistics in our next slide here, if we go on to our next slide, please. We can see here with these stats that they're very similar in the UK in terms of they have 1 in 6 adults. I would say that in the last year that has increased even more. And so you see there's a variety of different illnesses that also are very similar in terms of depression and anxiety in young people. If we go on to the next slide, the Canadian statistics. We see similarly as well that it's the 1 in 5 ratio. It's 1 in 4 also that we see that. Again, young adults are impacted more, like we see in Canadian statistics, around 10 to 20%, 5% of male youth, 12%. So we see here the same in terms of more females are impacted. And it also impacts the workplace, right? Where we see here that a lot of people take time off or spent, as according to these statistics, $6.3 billion on uninsured mental health services and time off work because of depression and stress that wasn't treated by the healthcare system. So we see here across these countries very similar in statistics. And on to our next slide. Now, having better understanding of what the definition of mental health is, especially compared to our faith, and taking a look at these statistics, let's now delve into what are the misconceptions, the main barriers, and the most common mental health challenges and illnesses and issues in our Muslim community. So we go on to the next slide, please. And this is where we're going to need your interactions, right? So it's not just going to be me talking. I know it's much more challenging when we do this virtually. When we are in person, of course, then we are much able to have this interaction a lot easier. So I'm just keeping my eye out here on the chat. So I'm going to be asking these questions in terms of what these misconceptions are. So if we take a look here at the first one here, mental health illnesses aren't real illnesses. Now, you and I both know, after looking at the statistics, that is not true. It is also very indiscriminate, meaning anybody, whatever socioeconomic background, faith, culture, diversity, whatever. It is indiscriminate, right? It is across the board, and it is not real. It is very much real, right? However, despite these statistics, there's still this attitude and very hurtful attitudes again around the mental illnesses and the signs and symptoms rather of that, right? And I always use the example of, well, if you break your arm or a leg, where would you go, right? You would go to the hospital. You would get support, put in a cast, and take care of it, pain, so on and so forth. There isn't really much stigma around that. It's accepted that that's what you would do, right? And people wouldn't just tell the person who broke their arm, get over it. It's understood there's a lot of pain, needs to be put in place, put the cast, healing, time, and taking care of that pain. That is understood. However, when we look at mental illnesses, don't have the same attitude, right? There's always this attitude of get over it, it's not real, there's something wrong with you, all of that, you know? And that type of attitude can really hurt somebody who's dealing with this and feel very stigmatized and isolated, right? So keep that in mind. Let's see here, number 2, all right? Mental illnesses will never affect me. Is that true or false? For those of you who are watching, can you just pop an answer? Is that true or false? Are mental illnesses independent of impacting me? Well, according to the statistics of what we just spoke about, that's not true. Absolutely, they're going to impact us, right? Again, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 6. I mean, these numbers are pretty close in terms of just think of in your family or when you go to the mosque or at school or your work. It could be anybody around you, right? That could be impacted. And again, it is indiscriminate, right? It's really important to understand that as well. So number 3, mental illnesses are just an excuse for poor behavior. This one's an interesting one, right? So it is true that some people who experience these illnesses may act in unexpected or strange ways to others, but we need to remember that it's the illness, that it's not the person. It's who is behind these behaviors, right? So no one chooses to actually experience a mental illness, just like nobody really chooses to break an arm or get diabetes, right? So people who experience a change in their behavior due to a mental illness may feel extremely embarrassed or shamed around others. So it's true that people who have a history, let's say, of mental illness are like anybody else. They just make poor choices of decisions, like everybody else, right? Or do something unexpected for reasons that could be completely unrelated to their illnesses. So number 4, bad parenting caused mental illness, right? Fact is, there's no one factor that can cause mental illnesses. These illnesses are complicated conditions. They arise from a combination of genetics, biology, the environment, life experiences, triggers, right? Trauma. So family members and loved ones, however, they do have a big role to play in the support and recovery. Number 5, people with mental illnesses are violent and dangerous. True or false? For those who are watching, I'd like to hear from you. Do you believe it's true or false? Well, very much so. When we take a look at this in terms of people with mental illnesses are violent or dangerous, we know that some people try to predict violence so they know what to avoid, right? However, the causes of violence, just like the causes, like what are the specific causes of mental illnesses, they're complicated, right? We see in research that mental illnesses are not a good predictor for violence. In fact, when we take a look at mental illnesses on their own, people who experience these illnesses are no more violent than people without a mental illness. What we do know is excluding people from communities is linked to violence. So people with a mental illness, like we said earlier, are amongst those who are excluded or isolated. And it's also important to note that people who experience these mental illnesses are much more likely to be victims of violence than to be violent themselves. So number 6, people don't recover from mental illnesses. True or false? The reality is that people can and they do and have recovered from mental illnesses. Obviously, there's so many different types of treatments and services and supports that can help, right? No one should expect to feel unwell forever. So the fact is that people who experience these illnesses, they can and do lead productive lives, engaged lives, they volunteer, they work, or contribute their skills that they have and abilities to their communities. So even when people experience these illnesses, let's say it lasts for a long time, they can still learn how to manage their symptoms so they can get back to their goals. So just like people, let's say, who all of a sudden get diabetes in their lives, right? What do they have to do? Well, they have to get assessed, make sure they have the proper glucose level, insulin, medication, right? Change their lifestyles, and they work around making sure that their diet and their exercise and their stress levels are manageable. So same thing when it comes to mental illnesses, just like physical illnesses, right? So it's really important that those, let's say, who continue to experience these challenges, it may be a sign that there needs to be a different approach. And I've seen that a lot in my clinical practice, where I'll be giving lots of examples of what I've seen of cases, as well as from the community, of course, all private and confidential. But I have seen in some cases where people, when they take medication or have the proper therapy, and it's just not working, it's because perhaps it's not the right combination, right? So just like when we take a medical treatment, sometimes we need to see what is the right dosage or what is the right medication before it does good for us. So same thing when it comes to medical treatment for that. So number 7, people who experience mental illnesses are weak and cannot handle stress. So the fact is that stress impacts our well-being. We know this, right? But it's true for everybody, regardless if you have a mental health challenge or not. So people who experience these illnesses may actually be better at managing stress than people who haven't experienced mental illnesses, because many people who live with mental health challenges, they learn skills. They learn stress management skills and problem solving day to day so they can take care of their stress before it impacts their well-being. So taking care of yourself and asking for help when you need are signs of strength, not weakness at all, right? Because we know from the prophetic tradition, prevention is better than the cure. Number 8, people who experience mental illnesses, they cannot work. True or false? For those of you who are on YouTube and Facebook. True or false? Well, fact is, whether you realize it or not, workplaces are filled with people who have experienced, like we said, the 1 in 4, 1 in 5 statistics earlier, right? So these illnesses doesn't mean that somebody's no longer capable of working. It's just some people can benefit from change at work to support their goals on their work outcomes, right? So many people work with few supports from their employer. That's the reality of that. And most who experience these serious illnesses want to work, but of course they face systemic barriers due to finding and keeping meaningful employment. Number 9, kids can't have a mental illness like depression. These are adult problems. Is that true or false? Well, the fact is, even children can experience this. And I'm sure those of you who have friends and families have seen that, know the reality of that, right? In fact, many mental health issues first appear when the person is very young. These illnesses look different in children than they do in adults, but they are a real concern. And they can also impact the way that people learn as young children, right? It impacts their brain development, how they learn and how they build their skills, which can lead to challenges in the future. So this is why it's very important when you notice these things, when people are noticing around you, family, friends, school, it's really important to get your child assessed early on, because it can definitely impact their brain development, learning skills, and so on and so forth. Because we know, unfortunately, I've seen many of this working in a university clinic where there's a lot of young people as children, they didn't receive the help that they need, and then they struggle later on. Number 10, everyone gets depressed as they get older. It's just part of the aging process. Is that true or false? What are your thoughts on that? Yes or no? Well, the reality is depression is never an inevitable part of aging. Older adults may have a greater risk of depression because they experience so many changes in their lives, right? In terms of their role, social networks, and so on and so forth. And also meaning in terms of what they are contributing to their society, their family, right? So if an older adult experiences depression, they need support just like anyone else. I find this is not so much in our own communities because we have such an emphasis, huge emphasis on families and our family interactions and sulat al-raham and our connections with everybody, right? I find this more outside of faith-based groups where perhaps, as soon as the elder is an elder, they are put into a home to be taken care of. Mind you, definitely there are situations where the families and the children can no longer take care of their ailing parents. Absolutely. And they need to be taken care of 24/7 in a home. That's a different type of situation that I'm describing here. What I am referring to is that it's almost like the attitude, as soon as you're 16, you're out of the house and, you're no longer under your parents. And as soon as you are an adult, that we no longer take care of you. So those changes definitely impact our elders, right? And in our communities, like I said, I don't find that much because we give so much respect and value to our elders. In fact, we still live with our elders, some of them, right? Some of our elders, they have their children still living with them in terms of marriage. They don't leave, right? The son would marry and bring the wife in. So there's much more emphasis on the family unit and the role and meaning, the position of the elder, which doesn't contribute to that. All right, so now that we've gone through all these misconceptions, we can take a look at that last one here. And this is a very common one that we have in our communities in terms of jinn possession, lack of faith, which leads to poor mental health, etc. We're going to delve into those a little bit deeper later on in our discussion. And it's always something interesting that I find. So if we take a look here, our next slide, in terms of what are the main barriers. So we see here that language is a big one here. And what I mean by language is not the syntax, but rather how we use language, right? So yes, there are perhaps people who would like to speak with a counselor with the same language, yes, but I'm referring more here to the language of mental health. When we hear the word depression, clinical anxiety, personality disorders, when we talk about schizophrenia, these are really scary to hear, right? Or taking a look at psychotic breakdown or perhaps suicidality. And I forgot to mention right at the beginning that we will be delving into some sensitive topic, so it's really important to be aware of that. And if you are impacted, to reach out, and we'll show you supports where you can reach out. You can see that on the screen as well as it comes out. So yes, language. If we talk about mental health illnesses in such a way where we're saying, you're depressed, you're anxious, you're that type of language can push people away because there's so much stigma still around mental health, right? So when we break it down in terms of looking at the signs and symptoms of depression, using the language such as, you're not feeling well, very lethargic, not energized as you were before, not engaged with things, the hygiene's probably off, feeling sad, not contributing, not engaged with school or work, that type of thing, not eating well, maybe overeating, undereating, oversleeping, undersleeping, these types of things and that characterize depression. People connect with that more than actually saying you're dealing with depression, right? So using that type of language can help people understand a little bit better that, I'm experiencing this. Okay, this is normal. I get it, etc., so on and so forth. Access is also important here in terms of taking a look at understanding where people can go and get the support. Whom do they actually talk to, right? So that's really important to understand. So let's take a look a little bit in terms of access and resources. It's really important to understand who are the practitioners, right? So I'll give you a quick 101 here, although this is a whole presentation that I do. So essentially, we're starting off with psychiatrists. So these are medical doctors who've gone through medical school and specialize in psychiatry that deals with major depressive disorder, serious illnesses such as schizophrenia, and so on and so forth, right? And personality disorders. A psychiatrist finishes a medical degree, like we said, and then a specialty in psychiatry. Then they also have the ability to diagnose, prescribe medication, like diagnose illnesses, prescribe medication, and treat, right? There is a you could say misconception around psychiatrists that they are pill poppers. They will just give you pills and say, see you in 6 months. Some do that. And there are those who absolutely don't do that, who go through the full treatment and talking like we do in psychotherapy. So these are the psychiatrists. You'll find them usually that they're covered under your medical system, wherever you are. And you don't necessarily have to pay private for them because they are medical doctors covered by the medical health insurance. Then you have general practitioner doctors, right? Who themselves can diagnose. Some are trained in mental health, but not fully like psychiatrists. They can diagnose and refer you and give you medications. And there's also the GP, general practitioner psychotherapists, where they are a combination of a doctor as well as specializing in actual therapy, similar to what psychotherapists, I'm mixing them up today. So psychotherapists, such as myself, so we finished graduate studies and we are not designated with a doctor title, but rather, at least in my province, as an RP, a registered psychotherapist. And we are part of a registered liable body, regulated body, just like medical doctors and lawyers and social workers. And so we are the ones that actually do a lot of the therapeutic work, right? We're more accessible that way. You'll find us in university centers, definitely, in medical centers or counseling services. You'll find us in government. You'll find us in community mental or health services, all over the place. And so some also do private practice where they charge per hour type of practices, or like I said, they work in institutions. So they are not covered under the national or the local health services. They are, unless they are working, like I said, in an institution where they're being paid. So then the person who accesses them doesn't necessarily have to pay per hour for the service, but then they can charge. And if you buy and have extended health insurance, then there's a percentage that can be covered with that. Then you have social workers who are very similar to psychotherapists. They also have graduate studies and a legal body that they follow. And social workers are more on the psychoeducational, case management, and so on and so forth. And so they connect differently with clients, and some do. In my own clinic, we have those who have social work degrees and do the exact same work as we do. They just have a different designation. So this is in terms of access and supports, and it's really, really important for those who are going to seek support. Make sure you go to the right person in terms of their qualifications. They're not just calling themselves a life coach or, a therapist without a regulated body, because they could be giving you the wrong advice to help you with your mental health issue. It's like going, for example, to somebody who has a mental health first aid certificate, right? And they just took a week-long course, versus somebody who's done the proper education and qualifications, right? So I want you to be really aware of who you see out there in terms of saying that they can help you, they can coach you, they can support you and transform your life. I would be very, very careful where to go get the professional help, as they are not qualified, regulated, trained professionals in the field. When it comes to culture, this is a sensitive one as well. When it comes to sensitive therapists as well, with therapy itself, sometimes people don't go to a therapist because they feel they're not going to understand them due to the culture differences. And what's interesting is that's quite different from my perspective, because I can see, having been trained in the field, that we do get trained in culture, right? And cultural diversity and sensitivity. Now, you don't necessarily have to go to a therapist from the same culture or faith to get good therapy, because again, they are trained in that. And this is the research that I did in my own graduate studies, that we saw that those who do have the basic understanding of culture and faith can be equally good in providing effective therapy as somebody of the same cultural background. The flip side of that is that sometimes people do not wish to go and see somebody of the same culture and background for confidentiality, for fearing that their privacy may be all out there for the community to see. So sometimes people from our own community prefer to see somebody outside of their own community, and fair enough. But I'm here to tell you, because we are all regulated under these bodies, there is a liability, especially when it comes to confidentiality. So last but not least, we'll see here the shame to family. And this one is a sensitive one as well, right? Because a lot of people will think of saying, well, you shouldn't go because, what are people going to say when they find out? What are people going to say or do when they realize and understand that you are going to talk about something very private, right? So there's a lot of that, and a lot of misconceptions around, if you marry somebody from a family who has somebody who's not well, then that's going to be genetic and carry on, or you're going to catch it like the flu, right? So all of these misconceptions, these promote exclusion, right? And what we want to do is we want to support laws and practices and in our communities and stop this discrimination against people with mental illnesses, so that we can promote inclusion, right? And that's the whole point of our session today, is to have this understanding so that we can reach out to those who are struggling, or if you are, know how to reach out and understand that there is a space, a safe space of people from your own communities as well. That's why we're doing this program, because the leaders in your communities felt that it was very important to again have this chat. So we go on to our next slide here. So why should mental health resources be accessed, right? First and foremost, to help process changes that we go through. And it's normal. My goodness, this whole year has been an incredible year of so many challenges and transitions and losses and griefs and so much, right? And so and we've seen the number one illness that has increased during the pandemic is not the virus itself and its impact, but rather mental health issues related to it, right? And so accessing these types of supports help you deal with these changes. It helps you go back to baseline functioning when you're dealing with getting off track, right? And then working through trauma, crisis, life struggle, changes again, right? Self-growth, so learning new skills and boundaries, self-confidence, self-esteem, especially body image issues when we're dealing with body dysmorphia or eating disorders, all of these types of things, right? And also spiritual, when we're talking about growth, it's not necessarily just these types of disorders, but also spiritual growth and the challenges and the development that we go through each stage and phases of our lives. It's for support, right? When you go through these challenges, sometimes you can't get support from friends and family because they're too close to the issue. And when you're too close inside of the box, it's hard to look outside to get the support, especially when you're in it. Whereas if you go to somebody, a third party who has no clue about who your family is or is away from the situation, can be neutral, can definitely provide you with available, like much more great supports, right? Finally, loneliness. I see a lot of international students who are so lonely, especially during the pandemic these days. And I find that having the space to talk to somebody, figuring out how to connect and make connections, and how to accept and work through these different life challenges that we all go through, you know? So it's these are some of the reasons. So it's not necessarily if you have a mental illness, but these are the challenges in your life that can also help you and benefit you when you do go see a counselor. So go on to our next slide, please. So we can see here some of the most common illnesses that we have in our Muslim communities. And this goes across the board in the general population as well. Anxiety, depression, suicide tend to be amongst the top, right? Then we look at addictions, and it could be substance abuse, drugs, alcohol, gambling, pornography. Interestingly enough, the Muslim Youth Helpline in the UK did a research, a poll, and in their poll, they found that there's an increase of women using pornography than before and compared to men. And the reason behind that was because of the lack of education that is provided for our young people, whereas they can easily access whatever is out there and then become addicted to it, right? So it's really, really important. And I encourage our community leaders to have these open talks. And I know sometimes it's very sensitive and it's taboo. However, our own faith encourages talking about sexuality within the appropriate realms to teach our young people, because they can easily access this very dangerously and easily out through our devices, right? So it's very, very important that us as parents, as leaders in the community, to provide this educational support, because I see a lot of young people coming, including from our Muslim community, who are in trouble and caught up in addictions that they really don't want to be because they didn't have the right education to support them. Mood disorders are pretty common as well, excuse me, especially borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder, which are sometimes seen, as we see down here, in abuse, right? So these mood disorders can exhibit themselves, including, by the way, narcissistic disorder, right? So cross-generational clashes and cultural issues, this is pretty common amongst parents as well as their youth. Parents who are brought up differently in their own countries coming here as first-generation immigrants, and then their kids, right? So there's this huge clash sometimes. And I've had the opportunity to travel all over the place, different communities around the world, looking at communication with parents and their youth. And I know we did that last time I was in Orlando, and that was a lot of fun with the youth to do that with the parents. And it bridges communication and understanding and compassion and wisdom, where the parents are always in awe of how their young people have so much wisdom. And then I'll in turn remind them, say, you taught them this. And then you have the young people who say, I didn't realize how much my parents cared about me when they set curfews and so on and so forth, things like that. So bridging communication in a safe space with our young people is so vital to hand over to them the next generation of power in our community and influence and leadership, right? So they continue programming, not just majalis, but holistic programming such as this to help our community. Also, we have identity issues, which is pretty common. We see a lot of that happening, especially with the rise of social media use and the impact, the negative impact of that. I invite you in a few weeks, actually next weekend coming up, we'll be doing another event with the Bain in Stanmore in London, where we'll be talking about social media. So once, inshallah, the poster is out, you can see it on my page, and then follow that. We'll be specifically talking about that. We're just quickly going over it here. Then we see also the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? On wars, from refugee crisis situations, from natural disasters, from political strife. All of these have a huge impact. And perhaps some of our elders may have experienced that and perhaps exhibit different signs that we weren't really aware of back then, right? So these are also common, and it can also be related to what we see here, abuse. So PTSD is not just necessarily wars and refugees. It can come across any type of trauma or impactful situation, from car accidents and so on and so forth. I actually just recently did a talk about trauma, and we connected it to the resilience society of Lady Zainab alayhi salam. You can find that on both my YouTube as well as my Instagram, and it was done through HIC Hussaini from London, where we explicitly went into detail. So I encourage, if you want to learn more about that, please do check out that lecture. Then we have issues related to domestic violence and abuse, sexual abuse, child abuse. These are also prevalent in our communities. What we hear mostly about is violence against women, domestic violence. And I'm here to also say that there also exists violence against men and abuse against men. And it's not seen the same. We'll get into the gender variances in a bit, but it does exist, and it's important to acknowledge that. The abuse that men experience may not be the same as more mental abuse, right? In terms of lowering the respect and dignity of the partner, just using them for money and value, and completely disrespecting them in front of the children. We hear these types of stories all the time. And it's also important to acknowledge and be aware, as we know, the domestic violence, and which has increased and skyrocketed during the pandemic because people have had to stay home, and some have been living in very unsafe situations. And it's been a struggle, and it's been heartbreaking to hear a lot of the stories. However, there are resources and supports out there like Nitsa Homes, which are, I believe, they're also available in the U.S. So those who are interested can reach out to me, and I'll make sure to connect you with the appropriate resources, inshallah. So finally, we have Islamophobia, which I know has been quite challenging for my American brothers and sisters in the last few years, and has also trickled over to Canada as well. We see it in the UK and different parts of the world where Muslims are living in. And so that also impacts our well-being and our mental health. I've done a whole session on the effects of Islamophobia. Please find them in the Muslim Counselor YouTube page. We also see eating disorders, also OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. These are also common challenges that we see in our community. There are across the board. We see this in research. We see this in our experience. We see this in all of our communities, not just the Muslim communities. If we can go on, please, to the next slide. So quickly here, if we look here at some of the, and I've already described some symptoms of depression. These are just things to keep aware of. And I have done full sessions on these. You can find more detail. Remember, this is more of a one-on-one intro and getting into levels and layers here. But we do give full sessions on anxiety and depression, and you'll see them on the Muslim Counselor YouTube page. We've gotten into lots of details on what signs to look out for, how to get support, and how to take care of yourself if you're dealing with either anxiety or depression. So what is counseling? If we go on to our next slide, please. So we have the definition here from the dictionary in terms of professional guidance of the individual by utilizing psychological methods, and especially in collecting case history data, using various techniques of the personal interview and testing interests and aptitudes. I find that to be a very technical definition, and we'll get into another definition in a moment, but we see here by Imam Jawad alayhi salam, where he talks about a believer needs a success from Allah, an advisor from inside him, and accepting the advices of those who advise him. And this for me is so powerful when we talk about getting support from people who are of faith and Muslim communities who say, you only need Allah to help you. You need to have stronger faith. You need to read more Quran. You need to read more dua. If only you do more of this, then you'll be okay. This shows you here that that's a taboo. That's a stigma. That's a misconception, because here Imam Jawad alayhi salam is saying, asking, right, and accepting advices of those who advise him, just like a counselor would. If we go on to the next slide, we'll see here in more detail the definition that I'd like to present and what I do in my work, and most therapists as well, in terms of being able to provide a confidential, safe, open space for our clients or our patients to talk about whatever it is that they come in for, to help you reach your goals, work with your problems, or provide you with strategies. Key thing here, we're not here to solve your problems, right? That's not our job. We're here to provide you with tools and strategies to help you cope with your challenges and manage to work through them. Now, when I do have students who come in and say, you know, they're failing a class, they're this, and that, these are technical situations where we can connect them with the appropriate resources and problem solve to help solve the problem, right? But when we're talking about counseling issues and mental health issues like we've looked at already, this requires sophistication and training on behalf of the healthcare provider to be able to provide the appropriate tools, right? And of course, to include different schools of thoughts of spirituality and faith. And I'd like to include that in my work as well, given that I work with a population of students that is a mixture of that. And of course, outside of my clinical work, I do a lot of mental health advocacy, and so many people, mashallah, I'm so happy, and I feel so overwhelmed sometimes at how many out there are dealing with situations. So when people reach out and ask for support, I'm always there to direct them to the appropriate resources, because I don't do private practice right now. I work full-time at the university. So when people reach out, which is wonderful, make sure to connect them with my colleagues who do private practice. Inshallah, at the end here of our presentation, we'll provide you with some resources locally as well as internationally. So back to what we do in the counseling space. It is a place of no judgment, of acceptance, no matter what it is to bring in. And this also helps our Muslim clients who feel sometimes that they are saying or doing things that go against the faith. That's not the space here. Who are we to forgive, right? When there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're here to support you and help you work through these struggles. Because sometimes going into doing things that are haram, we're not the haram police, but once people get into these places, it can cause stress and anxiety, right? So that can really help people. We do short-term or long-term. And like we said, there's a variety of topics that we can work on. And if it's something that we can't do, we always refer on to specialists or experts in the field that are much more specialized than what we would be doing. So go on to the next slide. So we take a look here that even though we've covered all of this right now, we can see that there are still those people who avoid counseling, right? And even those who are struggling with mental health illnesses don't seek help. And so we ask the question, why? Why don't people seek that help? There's still the stigma of denial, perhaps, of the illness, right? It only facing it or accepting that you have a mental health disorder or an illness makes it real. And it's hard to deal with. I've seen this with a lot of young people who perhaps are dealing with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, that it's hard for them to accept that they have this, so that they don't get the support and assessment and diagnosis and treatment, including medication. So it can be really challenging for them. And also, a lot of people would rather deal with it alone, right, than show weakness. And we've said earlier that, just like the Imam, accessing support and accepting advice, and that requires strength. That shows strength and courage that people do that, right? So again, when we look at why do people avoid, we said, this fear of people finding out, shame, low faith, you're not a good Muslim, you got to do more du'as, right? There's also the shame of discussing personal family issues outside of that, especially when we're dealing with marital prospects, that people are going to find out, they've got this, I don't want to deal with that. There's also the fear of mislabeling, which can lead to unnecessary stigmatization, right? So people, they don't have necessarily psychiatric issues, but because they could be mislabeled, they're afraid of that. And there's somehow a reflection, like we've been saying all along, of a lack of faith, or it's a punishment from a God for previous sin, or the belief that this challenge just requires patience and perseverance and prayer, and that should alleviate what the person's going through. There could be this can lead to a lot of religious shaming, as we call it, right? So, and we want to look at is counseling only were affected with mental health illnesses. This is a great article here that delves into these topics. We know that that's not true. Like we said earlier, it's people who are taking care of themselves, their overall health, they're lonely, and like we said, they need a third-party objective opinion. So let's get into gender variances, because this is always fun to get into, right? So if we go into the next slide. So what are your thoughts on that? Muslim men usually deny or have more negative attitudes towards help seeking. Why do you suppose that is? Those who are watching, can you give us a reason of why do you suppose that Muslim men deny or have more negative attitudes towards help seeking? What do you suppose that is? For those who are watching, what are your thoughts on that? Well, what's interesting here, this has to do with the classic, eternal discussion of nature versus nature, nurture versus nature, and also the misconceptions around mental health and men and women and how people engage and talk about things, right? So men usually, when there are challenges, the idea that we know is that they kind of isolate themselves or or hang out with their buddies, or smoke shisha or go on their phone video games rather than talking about issues, right? They stay silent. women, on the other hand, have the tendency to be able to express more feeling. And it has a lot to do with the way that we are raised, right? Young boys are taught not to show emotions and that it's not good. You have to be a man, men don't cry. And what's interesting, there's a great project by brother Hussain, and I'm just going to grab his project here that I'm going to show you in the UK, where he talks about, or through his photography, capturing images of men and their emotions, right? And it's a very powerful project. His name is Hussam Al-Din, and if you go to hussam.co.uk, in his project, he captures these images of men in the midst of emotion, all in the goal and attempt to express that men can cry. And this is all part of, you see here, and it's all part of normalizing, right? It's all part of normalizing. I'm going to bring this up here and you can see the pictures here. It's all about normalizing emotions, and it's very powerful, as you can see here, right? So it's I think there's so much beauty in normalizing something in our communities, where for generations the idea was, no, you don't show emotion, and that it's not manly to show this emotion. And I think these are very striking, powerful images. I remember at the time that when the brother was working on this project, I was in London in the Muslim Vibe office, actually, and then he popped in and I could hear him excitedly talking about this. And it was really neat to have heard about it from the beginning, and then afterwards, see what he was talking about, and see here, this is also a very powerful image as well. And when we see these here, I often connect it to how in our own faith we are encouraged to show emotion, as exemplified by the strong men that we respect in our communities, right? In our faith. It's a very, very powerful image as well. It's probably one of my favorite ones. And I find these just so powerful that, we're normalizing that men do cry, men do show emotion, and you are allowed, and it's okay, right? And this idea here, if we look at it from a faith-based perspective historically, we've seen, for example, Nabi Allah Yaqub, how he cried for decades over his son that was even alive. He knew he was alive, Nabi Allah Yusuf, to the point where he became blind, right? And the grief that he carried over losing somebody, he was openly expressing that emotion. We see how the Prophet ﷺ, how he showed emotion and grief when his son died, right? We see that how he showed his grief when Sayyidah Khadija ﷺ passed away. We see Sayyidah Fatima al-Zahra, when she passed away, how Imam Ali expressed his grief, how he also expressed his grief over the passing of the Prophet. So you see that, and you see, of course, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, how he showed his lifetime of emotion and grief over his father, Hussein alayhi salam. These are the Islamic figures that we revere, that are normalizing showing and expressing emotion. Yet in our cultural societies, there is this attitude of not doing that and not teaching our young men that it's okay. Rather, it's the opposite, right? There's shaming around that, which I find quite ironic, given that in our majalis, we are encouraged to cry for Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. However, in our greater community, there is this upbringing of, you got to be tough, you don't show emotion, and vulnerability, right? You're not supposed to show this vulnerability. And we see, for example, in the figure of Al-Abbas alayhi salam, where he showed that vulnerability, where he did not want, he wanted to appease and get water for the thirsty children. He showed that vulnerability in his tears of not being able to do so, right? Of course, these are very, very extraordinary people and extraordinary circumstances, but they serve as lessons for us that, hey, look at these strong male figures and how they showed emotion. And then it's okay for us to show that vulnerability, but we have to work around that, right? And this is why we see here, where the statistics, for example, here, they're strongly gendered, with Muslim women and women in general, not just Muslim women, expressing higher levels needs for mental health services than men, because of the negative attitudes, right, towards help seeking. We talked already about it in terms of nature and emotion, and how women perhaps are used to seeking support by talking to one another, right? And we're talking about this from childhood, right? So, alhamdulillah, there's been more openness over the last few years. And I highly recommend you go check out these pictures. It's you can see it on Instagram as well, ha.me, his page, and you can check them out and more. So question here, is it true that mental health illnesses affect more women than men in our population and the general population? Well, according to what we just said here, no, right? It's because of how skewed it is, right? Because how women come out more to get support. It's because of that, not because they have more mental health issues, right? What's interesting is that I see quite a few males that come into my practice for getting support, and ironically from the Arab community. So definitely these statistics, so to speak, are skewed in that sense. So let's go on to our next slide here in terms of looking at how to get support for a family member or friend. Somebody approaches you and they're struggling, or you see that they're struggling. Listen, right? We want to be listening and accepting and encourage counseling and support. Obviously, if you are not a therapist, and even if you are and it's a close family member, it's going to be hard to provide that. And ethically, you're not supposed to, because it's a dual relationship, right? So being absolutely there to support and direct to the appropriate resources is really important. Listening means that no matter what they say, even if you don't like it, you're open to listening to it. We cannot be the haram police and judge. If somebody comes to you and says, I have these thoughts and feelings of self-harm and so on, haram, you're going to go to hell. They're not going to come to you for after that. They're going to feel rejected and not supported. So it's really important to show acceptance even if you disagree. Right? That's the key thing here. Then there's this article here that you can check out in terms of how you can support and help a family member. And in terms of resources, here they are. Free counseling supports, including actual full counseling by Nasiha. I work very closely with them. They're a wonderful group and they offer support online, texting, as well as on the phone. So this is for North America. Those who are in the UK, who are anybody who's watching, there is the Muslim Youth Helpline. They're very similar to Nasiha. Nasiha also does a lot of psychoeducational programming as well, where they can come into your center or do it virtually. So I highly recommend, if you want more specific topics, to work with them as well as a center. And here in North America, we have Nasimco is working very closely with Nasiha, where we have been delivering. I've been working with them as well on beautiful and very informative mental health programming that have been aired through Ahl Bayt TV, and you can find them on our Nasimco YouTube page. So we've been collaborating and working with them. So if we just go back to the slide before at the very bottom, please. This is an initiative that we will be slowly rolling out through the Imam Mahdi Association of the Marja'iyya, the liaison office of Imam or Sayyid Sistani office, Hafadullah. So you can check out, we don't have it yet on the website, but I'm also working with them on this project. You will find it at imam/us.org, where inshallah we'll be providing supports and resources. We have already started with the webinars. For those of you, if you want more information, you can check out their Instagram page or their YouTube page, or even on their website, we'll find out more information. We started with doing the webinars where we've had some great discussions on Islam and psychology, on just how to navigate challenges as a Muslim living in the West. So you've seen those are already available on our YouTube, the Imam YouTube page. So highly recommend, keep your eyes open for that. We'll also be giving out a survey soon because we want to get feedback and understanding what are the challenges that your communities are dealing with, so that us as part of the Marja'iyya can provide the support inshallah for you. So keep your eyes out open for that. So going to the next slide. It's really exciting, that mashallah at the Marja'iyya level, there's this awareness and acknowledgement how important it is with our families and our community, especially our youth. So see here, within the Orlando community, you have, mashallah, people specialized in these types of counseling. So they are available to you in your communities. And there's also Sister Anisa Diab, who I personally know. I do not know the other counselors, but I personally know Anisa Diab. You can check out her new website and you can tell her that Berak referred us to you. So she also does counseling supports, highly professional, highly educated, mashallah, and trained and knowledgeable. And she also does a lot of public speaking advocacy like I do, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to work with her in person as well as online. So highly recommend her. You can check out her pages on Instagram and Facebook and her website for more information on counseling. And then there's my email here that I've provided, that if you have any questions or concerns, you can contact me. But like I said, I do not do personal counseling or private counseling right now. However, I will be more than happy to connect you with the appropriate resources and professionals within the network of people that I know, inshallah. So we go on to our next slide. So here I have some really great books that I can recommend for you to learn more about mental health, Islam, and so on and so forth. I actually have the books right here as well as on screen. So here we have the Counseling Muslims Handbook for Mental Health Issues and Interventions by Samira Ahmed and Mona Amr. So this book here, it's a pretty big book. Then we have this one here, which is by Marwan Dwairi, which is Counseling and Psychotherapy with Arabs and Muslims, a culturally sensitive approach. So this is really great for practitioners as well as those who would like to learn more about that. And a recent book that I got, which I have not finished yet, is called Islam and Mental Health Beliefs, Research and Applications. This is fairly recent. I got it a few weeks ago. I'm not done reading it yet, by Harold G. Cohen and Saad Saleh al-Shuhaib. So this is a really great book so far in terms of that. It is not, these books are from our Sunni brothers and sisters. Inshallah, one day we can come out with a Shia book from the Ahl Bayt perspective, but these are a great start to kind of get the connections and do. And then we have this book of all the perfumes of Arabia, which I had the opportunity to review and give a review on it by Brother Bilal Muhammad. He has a whole chapter dedicated to depression, anxiety, and mental health. And each chapter he talks about the different perfumes and oil perfumes and the significance in Islamic history and philosophy and you name it, spirituality. And the one on chapter on mental health is just beautifully connected to lavender, which is known to lower stress and anxiety. And speaking of lowering our stress and anxieties, if we go on to our next slide, very important to understand the importance of self-care, right? How to ask for help, why it's important. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in a vicious cycle if sometimes, you can't get out of what you were stuck in, right? So keeping track of your mental health is vital. And inshallah, in our next session, we will be taking an explicit look at that. But from now until then, I'm going to remind you, if we go on to our next slide, please, we'll take a look at how to take care of yourself with the basics, right? We want to have that balance and routine of healthy eating, healthy sleeping, exercise, spiritual inner peace, medication if needed, right? Good relations with families and friends, cutting off toxic relationships, and counseling and talking to somebody that you need to able to work through these challenges, or attend lectures or more workshops and check out the variety of different workshops and resources that we have online, whether it's through your community, through the Muslim Counselor, Nasimco, or the Marja'iyya, and so many other channels that I've worked with and not worked with. There's so much great information out there. Just again, be cognizant of who you are getting the information from and what their training is. Finally, I'd like to end off with this beautiful tradition that we have that is attributed to Imam Ali alayhi salam. And at the beginning of our session today, we looked at reflection. We looked at how reflection and dhikr and remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can attain that inner peace. Here we end off with this beautiful, beautiful quote where it talks about how your remedy is within you, but you do not sense it. Your sickness is also from within you, but you do not perceive it. You presume that you are a small entity, that you of little worth, little value. But the Imam says here, within you is enfolded an entire universe. You are indeed the evident book by whose alphabet the hidden becomes manifest. Therefore, you have no need to look beyond yourself. What you seek is within you, if only you reflect. And inshallah, through this session today was a great start and a beneficial start for you to reflect and understand what mental health is all about, what are some of the signs and symptoms, how to ask for support, understanding the misconceptions and the taboos. If you go on to our last slide, also to finish off, so you understand, inshallah, in terms of what are some of the things that you learned and benefit from, what are the things that you can take from this moving forward as becoming ambassadors to your community, in terms of what you're going to take out there to help and support other people, how you can see if somebody is struggling, how you can connect them with the appropriate resources, and inshallah, even for yourself. So, any questions? For any of you who do have questions, please do not hesitate to send me a message, whether it's through social media, Instagram, Facebook, or the muslimcounselor@gmail.com, and I will do my absolute best, inshallah, to connect you with the appropriate resources or send you to the appropriate professionals that can help you, inshallah. So, I don't see any questions, which means that we've all become knowledgeable, inshallah, in this area, and that we can carry this on over into our communities and helping our brothers and sisters so nobody can feel isolated and rejected and not welcomed, right? Because the whole point of these types of sessions is to normalize and destigmatize and get rid of the misconceptions and the taboos so that we can embrace one another, support each other. Just like you have physical illnesses, we have mental health challenges as well. When you hear about somebody who's gone to the hospital because they've got a break in their bones, we don't bat an eyelash. But when we hear that somebody has gone because of break in spirit, we have all of these misconceptions. And I hope that this simple but humble presentation, inshallah, today was a good start for you to reflect upon this. And inshallah, in our next session, we'll go deeper in terms of taking a look at how to take care of your mental health by de-stressing. We'll be doing a great mindfulness release exercise as well. Thank you very much. May Allah bless you. Please do remember us in your du'as these holy days leading into Sha'baniyah, inshallah, and leading to the holy month of Ramadan. Thank you very much, my dear brothers and sisters in Orlando and anywhere else where you are watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.